All right, Alexander, let's do a Q&A from the live stream with Garland and Nixon. And let's start things off with Commander Crossfire, who says the two aims of the party are to conquer the whole surface of the earth and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought.
Yeah,
That's a
very
quote.
well put, beautifully put.
Michael Wynn, thank you for that super sticker. Sticky Mark says at Alex Christoforou, Schultz making a bad joke, but if he thinks his comedy is better than yours, then Trudy Castro has a bridge to sell him. Thank you for that, Sticky Marks. Commander Crossfire says this is one of two. If you don't want to lose yourself in a desperate situation, you must purge your soul of doubts, regardless of your feeling towards Russia. There are two camps, two ideas, and two men leading those camps, and you shall support one idea, one camp, and one man. Embodying this idea, you shall hold on to the end, for otherwise neither death nor torture will justify you in your own eyes.
Okay, good. I mean, it's rather emphatically put, poetically put, but I mean, I get the point, and I think, I don't disagree.
Valley S, thank you for that super chat. Lover of the Russian team, thank you for that super sticker. Not a banned account says, how intimidated is Putin by Biden's midterm victory?
I don't think he's in the slightest bit interested, is the short answer. I don't think it even registers. I mean, I think if the Republicans had won a big majority and had started investigations and done all kinds of various things, well, I think Putin would have raised an eyebrow, and that might have, had, giving him a moment to comment about, but I don't think it would have changed his policy, and I don't think the actual result is going to change his policy. I don't get the sense that Putin follows American politics, that sort of American politics very closely, and if you follow Russian commentaries before the midterms, they were all predicting that whatever the outcome would be, US policy would remain unchanged.
From Risis, will Russia stop selling its commodities to the West and its allies?
Well, if they pay a good price, why wouldn't the Russians want to sell? The Russians have up to now never said that they're not prepared to sell commodities to the West, and if the Russians benefit from the trade, they will do it. It's the Western powers that have launched this economic war. It's the Western powers that are facing the consequences of doing that. The Russians always say they're open to anybody to do business who's prepared to do business with them. Of course, one thing I will say is this. When you wreck a relationship as completely as it's been wrecked with the West, then obviously if you're looking forward to more trade deals in the future, well, you're probably not going to get them because the Russians will not want to put in long-term investments which could be torn up, it could be negated in the future. But if it's a question of buying, say, Russian palladium or titanium, well, if the Russians have it to sell, why shouldn't they sell it?
Not a banned account says, how soon can we hope for a NATO attack on Russia?
Oh, I hope never. I mean, I think that would be suicide, by the way. I mean, I think that, remember, it is the world's biggest nuclear power. And that hasn't, nothing that's happened this year has changed that. In fact, if anything, I was looking at the nuclear military balance. It seems to have shifted even further in Russia's favour over the course of this year. I mean, they're now equipping more hypersonic glide vehicles on their nuclear weapons. They've launched more nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. So I think overall the military balance, the nuclear military balance, is shifting in their favour.
Not a banned account says, will the Ukraine counterattack Russian cities soon?
No. There are some concerns in Russia that what Ukraine might do is launch an attack in Belgorod and Kursk. And I know that Russian troops have been transferred into those areas. But I think that would be a crazy thing for the Ukrainians to do. I think the Americans would not be pleased I think if Ukraine launched that kind of attack on Russia, that would precipitate an all-out war, and perhaps even a declaration of war. And I think that would change completely the entire geometry of the struggle, the conflict, in a way that the Americans wouldn't like. So I don't think it's going to happen.
Sparky says, great guest. Garland Nixon has the wisdom of Solomon and the patience of Job.
Yes, very well put.
Sparky. Stigma says, proudly ordered my Serbian cap from the Duran store. Keep fighting, guys. We need you. Megapi apopatra. Thank you, Stigma, for that. Melkor Borgir says, Russia supplies 87% of the world's titanium. Why do they continue to export this to the West?
Because they make money on it. It's the short answer. And I mean, you can hoard your titanium. You can keep it in Russia. That will create industrial disruption in the West. That will give more force to the Biden-Sunak narrative, which is to blame every problem economically on the Russians. But eventually, I mean, titanium is not, only found in Russia. So the Western powers would find an alternative. So, from a Russian point of view, I don't think it makes any huge sense. I think they'll just go on selling titanium as long as the West wants to buy it at an ever-increasing premium.
Pinyamamba, thank you for that super sticker. Not a band account says, after losing Kherson, will Russia soon surrender?
No. All the indications, actually, and we've had more over the course of this week since we did the program with Garland, is that the Russians at the moment are working towards a winter offensive. And Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has just talked in those sort of terms, and I think that's what we should expect. He said that the operations continue. Russia is not going to be put off by the winter, and the Russian build-up goes on.
Juha Avenan says, it's getting harder and harder to understand what's going on, but something is going on.
Well, we try and explain it as best we can, however hard it is.
From Not a Band account says, are Democrat midterm victories approval of Biden?
Well, I don't know whether they are approval of Biden exactly, but they do reinforce the position of his administration. I mean, I don't think one can dispute this. From his point of view, it's been a success. I mean, if there'd been a big Republican landslide, if the Republicans had taken the Senate and got a big majority in the House, impeachment would have been very likely. An impeachment process would have been very likely. I don't think that's going to happen now, and he must be pleased with that. I don't think this is a huge vote of support for Biden across America. I think it's very much more complicated, as we discussed in the program with Robert Barnes. But whatever it is, I mean, it's a success for Biden. Of that, there's no doubt.
Red Viking says, Alexander's surprised face when I told the Duran in Denmark states will lend you money for your energy bill was so funny, but now it's been implemented, and with 2% interest rate and 10% inflation, I take it.
Good grief. Well, there we go.
Sparky says, will the lack of a red wave in the U.S. midterms influence Russia on whether or not they take Odessa? I don't think Russia should leave out Odessa.
Well, I don't think they will leave out Odessa. I'm still convinced it's part of their overall plan. But of course, withdrawing from Kherson region makes it very, very difficult to implement that plan. I don't know what their plans are. But the midterm results are not going to have any effect on Russian military planning at all.
Ricey says that Duran should do a collaboration with Aussie Cossack. Okay, we will look it up. Sparky says the Republican establishment sabotaged Republicans in the midterms to keep peace-minded people out. McConnell, Graham, etc.
I don't disagree with that. I think that's probably right. I don't get the impression that Mitch McConnell, for example, is particularly bothered by these results. I think he'd far rather have the Biden administration and the Democrats in control of the Senate than he would want a MAGA-dominated Republican Party moving towards victory in 2024.
Detox, thank you for that super sticker. Angry Warhawk says, can you guys invite Rush V on your show?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure who this is, but
reach out.
Sorry?
I know who it is.
Okay.
We'll try. We'll try. Brazilianaire Bob says Russia will not negotiate or freeze this war while leaving predatory forces right on their doorstep. They never did this during World War II, and I can't see them doing it now.
Well, Peskov has just said that. That's exactly what Peskov said. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, also said something very similar. He said there's no sign of any negotiations, any real negotiations. So whatever was discussed in Ankara between Narishkin and Burns, it didn't obviously go very well.
AD says the Russians are going for full mobilization by DEZ, by December, I guess. Definitely no freezing of the conflict. They cannot keep 500,000 soldiers mobilized forever, so logically a huge action is coming. Do not forget Afghanistan. The Americans are empty.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. I mean, I think that's entirely right. You don't call up 300,000 men and then have them sitting around in trenches twiddling their thumbs. I think that's entirely correct. I think that the Russians are moving towards a winter offensive over the next few weeks, and I've no doubt about that. Colonel McGregor thinks the same thing. He's talked about the calm before the storm.
Mamalaska says, with the new U.S. nuclear policy changing to preemptive first strike, how likely is it the U.S. uses nukes on Russia? I don't see U.S. and NATO winning the war.
Well, I don't think so. I still believe that there are far too many rational people in Washington to allow something like that, to stop something like that from ever happening. But I have to say this, I've been reading some of the commentaries, some of the articles that have been appearing in the United States, and I'm sorry to say in Britain too, and it's clear to me that some people are now working hard to try to normalise the idea that nuclear weapons might be used. And I'm afraid there are also some people, in Britain specifically, Simon Tisdale being a case in point, who believe that if you attack the Russians, they won't react and that it's all a bluff. And I remember the same people saying the same thing during the siege of Aleppo in Syria in 2016. And I thought it crazy and irresponsible then. And I think it is crazy and irresponsible now. But it is very, very worrying that these people do exist.
Touch the Riot says, glad to watch here on Rumble, where I can do this. Send you a rant to say thanks for sharing your brain trust. Good day, gents.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
That from M. Wick. I am concerned about the West being reactivated. Reports were starting to phase out the Ukraine narrative. Militarily, a sound decision, but I doubt that would be politically the right approach.
I'm not sure I completely follow you. I mean, the West being reactivated. Do you mean that the Western Alliance, NATO, is being recalibrated? Well, it has been. But actually, look at the actual military movements. They've not actually added any real military power to NATO. It's been an awful lot of theatre and an awful lot of talk, and some of it very dangerous and very reckless talk. But I still think the US military won't want to take on the Russians.
Toilet Sauce says, I maintain what I've been saying since the grain deal was concluded. The Russians won't even try for Kharkov, Kryvyi Nikolaev, and Odessa. Putin got his land bridge to Crimea. He never stated a desire for more territory.
This is all true, and you may be right. I still think that we've now passed the point in this war where the Russians will simply stop there. And one of the reasons I don't think they will stop there is because the Ukrainians won't let them stop there. If the Ukrainians came along and said, look, we're prepared to negotiate, we're prepared to accept loss of all of these regions, and we're prepared to do a deal on that basis and keep out of NATO and all of those things, then I think the Russians would agree. But what the Ukrainians are doing instead is attacking the Russians in all of these places. Given that that is so, what option ultimately do the Russians have but to keep going?
From summer of 1970, American elections are fraud, in my opinion. Paper ballots and multiple independent exit polls are desperately needed. No electric voting unless the machines are open source.
I totally agree with that. I agree with that entirely. I mean, even if they aren't fraudulent, there is the appearance of fraud, and that's almost as bad. I should say, by the way, that I believe that at least in some pressings, in some of the big urban centres which are controlled by Democratic Party machines, all sorts of bad things are happening. In fact, I'm absolutely sure of it. I was in 2020, and I'm sure of it again in 2022.
Mr. Wonderful says anti-Trump rhino operatives are out in force. Ignore them, shun them, and stay the course. 2 years till the day of judgment. Much can change.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good moral position to take, by the way. Never give up, never lose hope. Always look on to the next battle. And that's a good way of thinking.
Not a banned account says sanctions encourage EU industry to flee to the US.
Well, that's just Garland's point, that he's made it in very eloquently and very powerfully. I'm going to make one observation, which is that, of course, if EU industry goes and relocates in the US, it will eventually become US industry. And unless you change the situation in the US itself, then that EU industry will wither in just the same way as US industry has done. Because you have to change the economic climate, the whole regulatory business climate in the United States to make industry prosper.
Toilet Sauce says Putin wants to refreeze the conflict so that he can heat it up at will, to use it as leverage against the West.
Well, that might be what he wants to do, but I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give him that option. As I said, at the moment, they're attacking. They're continuously attacking, not very successfully, but you can't freeze a conflict unless both sides agree. And unless the US decides to tell the Ukrainians to freeze the conflict. And of that, I don't see any sign at the moment.
From Sparky, Brazil had a change in leadership. There is a degree of uncertainty. How it will affect BRICS and Brazil's relationship with Russia? Did it cause Russia to move forward with its recent withdrawal?
No, I don't think so. I think, on the contrary, that on balance, if anything, the Russians probably are pleased to see Lula back. I don't mean that they had a bad relationship with Bolsonaro, not at all. And I don't mean by that either that they made any assessment about which of these two leaders, Bolsonaro or Lula, would have been better for Brazil. But they know Lula well. Putin and Lula have worked very effectively and successfully in the past, and I think that they expect that Lula, if anything, is going to be more accommodating to them than Bolsonaro was.
OMG Puppy says MAGA reindustrialization would have helped the working class. The neoliberal reindustrialization will only make the super rich more rich.
Absolutely correct. That's essentially the point I made before. I mean, just, bring a German factory and plonking it in the United States isn't going to change anything in the end. It might buy you a few years, but ultimately, if your business environment is bad in the US, then that factory will also wither and decay, like all the rest of the industrial base has done. And yes, I agree, the usual people will benefit in the meantime. They'll make all the money, they'll, plunder its skills and abilities and all of that, but it won't provide long-term working class jobs.
M. Wick says the same people who are complaining about Trump still talking about the 2020 shenanigans are wondering why the red wave has not happened and why counting will take weeks in Arizona until the right result is achieved.
No, absolutely. Well, of course, and they're right to worry and wonder about all of those questions. I mean, we are making this programme a week after our meeting with Garland, and the voting is still continuing. Or rather, the counting of the voting is still continuing. Now, that is unbelievable. That is incredible. That is ridiculous. That is shameful. It's disgraceful.
From Mr. Wonderful, industry will not flee to the U.S. The U.S.'s regulation and energy restrictions. Industry will flee to Russia, China, and India.
I think that you're probably right. I think it will initially go to China and perhaps India and perhaps also East Asia, more than it will to the US. Some industry will go to the US because it's still a big market and the Germans will want to keep a presence in the United States. So they will put some factories there. But overall, I agree. I think Garland is right about the plan and the intention. But I think overall, the way this will play out will not work out in the way that the neocons and people like that hope.
Najavel, thank you for that super chat. Eric Halverson, thank you for that super sticker. McDuff Lives 2 says, it's still the British Empire. The US is just the muscle.
Yeah, I know a lot of people think this, and I sometimes wonder myself, actually. The influence some people from Britain exercise in the United States always amazes me. And though I have an English accent myself, the traction a British accent can give you in the United States also amazes me too.
Not a band account says, will Russia back down facing a Harris presidency?
I think they'll laugh at the prospect of a Harris presidency rather than back down, actually. I think most of the world would.
Linda Petit, thank you for that super chat. Elza says, I don't know much, but I feel like the world is tired of being shaken up by the U.S. elections and pre-elections. Can only the de-dollarization end it?
You know, I think you're right. I think these midterms, in a way, were a seminal event because everybody, myself, lots of people, were saying to each other, well, you know, the big event this autumn is going to be the midterms. And what came was something with all the impact of a busted flush. I mean, it was just nothing. And I think people will, from this moment on, start to say to themselves, well, the midterms, what goes on electorally in America isn't as important anymore. And that's bad for America, by the way, because one of the features of the US was that it held the world's attention. If it doesn't hold the world's attention, if people start losing interest in what the US is doing, then that will also confirm that its power is in decline.
Margarita, thank you for that super chat. Yang Damin, thank you for that super chat. Birdman, thank you for that super sticker. Not a bad account says, do you expect support for Biden to continue through 2024?
No, I don't even think he's going to stand in 2024, despite the fact that he says he is. I don't think so. I think, on the contrary, with growing economic problems, which are going to get worse, I think support will drain away. The trouble is, I don't know where it will drain to. And given how weak the Republican Party still is, that's the real problem.
Mo Money says, I wish people would remember today, of all days, what the world lost fighting fascism in the 1940s Europe. And now we're supporting it wholeheartedly.
I completely agree with you. I completely endorse your sentiments.
Zionic 8, thank you for that super sticker. Joe Rin, thank you for that super sticker. That dude, thank you for that super sticker. And Matriputra says, I think there's been a deal in the background talks between Selvin and Patrushev. That the Russians will stay on the east of the Dnieper and Ukraine will get to keep Odessa.
My own impression is that there's been no deal of any kind whatsoever. I've been looking at Russian statements that have been coming out since these meetings, and they are very tough. And my own impression is that the Russians have had these discussions with Sullivan and with Burns in Ankara, and they've come to the view that the Americans came to these meetings empty-handed.
CC says predatory as the US is to the EU, I still hold most of my anger to the treasonous and shameless bureaucracy that presides over us here. We have been betrayed by our own, not Americans.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think that's an entirely correct statement. I mean, America does what America does. I mean, it's a great power. It maneuvers. Takes its particular positions on global affairs. It's sometimes predatory towards its allies, but ultimately, it is European leaders who have betrayed the European people. I feel much more angry when I think of the situation in Europe. I feel much more angry towards people like Ursula von der Leyen, Borrell, and all those awful people, not to mention Habeck and Baerbock and Macron and all the others, than I do towards anybody in the United States over this.
Mr. Wonderful says losing the House and Senate is not a victory.
Well, they've lost the House, but they've held on to the Senate. And no, I agree, it's not a victory, but it's not the clear-cut defeat that many were looking forward to.
JS Scott 6, thank you for that super sticker. Zoran Marinovic says the only oracle I trust is the one from London.
Thank you.
CC says maybe the US will eventually turn inwards, but for now our establishment distinguishes between the Anglosphere and the EU.
Yeah, I agree with that also. And I mean, consider that when you look at all of the issues that concern Americans, there's been opinion polls, both from the Republican and the Democrat side, and they talk about essentially domestic issues: inflation, jobs, abortion, education, healthcare, all of those kind of things, COVID. The one thing they do not talk about, they're far down the list, is Ukraine. And yet, the political class in Washington remains obsessed with Ukraine. And that tells you how distinct their concerns are from those of the American people.
Deidre, thank you for that super chat. Lelo16501, thank you for a super sticker. Mr. Wonderful says Zelensky traded the Oscar for a bag of devil's dandruff already.
Very good.
Mr. Wonderful says no one is focused on North Korea as expected.
And that's absolutely right. And of course, the North Koreans are pressing forward with their nuclear weapons programs, their ICBMs. They've been firing more missiles. And apparently they're working hard on building a nuclear-powered submarine, which will also be capable of launching nuclear missiles. The North Koreans are the big winners, one of the big winners of this war, because they've forged good relations. They've improved their relationships with the Russians. They'll now be looking, I expect, to get economic support for the Russians in return for all the diplomatic support the North Korea has been giving. So they'll be wanting fertilizer to help North Korea with its food production. They'll want petroleum products. They'll want accesses to technologies. And I wonder whether the Russians would be as averse to supplying all of those things as they might have been a few years ago.
Commander Crossfire says Russia is not the USSR. Its capabilities are limited. Unlike the 1940s, the whole West is consolidated in their efforts to crush Russia. The fighting in Ukraine is only a small part of the epical struggle Russia can lose.
I think this is correct if Russia was alone. I mean, Russia is not the USSR, and it's important to say this. It's not, the global superpower that the USSR at its peak definitely was. And of course, it's, relatively speaking, got less powerful armed forces than the USSR certainly did have. So I think that is absolutely correct. You mustn't underestimate how consolidated the West was in opposition to the USSR as well. I lived through the Cold War, and I know. And the other thing that's changed radically since the end of the Cold War is that Russia today is anchored in much more powerful alliances than the USSR was. The USSR, once its relationship with China went west in the early 1960s, was basically much more isolated in global affairs than today's Russia is. Today, Russia has good relations with China, it's got good relations with India, it's got good relations with lots of countries. So it's in a much stronger diplomatic position than the USSR used to be, even if it is inherently less powerful.
A says, Dugin said in The Great Awakening versus The Great Reset, the globalists are pushing a single narrative of what it means to be a human. It won't be long before referring yourself as a human becomes offensive.
Yes. I think that was one of the most insightful things Dugin has said. Dugin is full of insight. He's very, very good at this. Where he's less good at, and I've said this before, is coming up with alternatives, workable alternatives. That's my major criticism of him.
Paul Dorofeyev says abstract power, social, political, financial, should always be backed by physical power, energy, commodities, military.
Absolutely true. And I think people in Washington are slowly finding that out. People in Britain have certainly found that out.
Alexander Podyachev says, would the de-dollarization throw off the plan to reindustrialize the U.S.?
Yes. I mean, the two are not compatible with each other. I mean, dollarization makes it more difficult in some ways to reindustrialize the US. So if the United States went away from having a reserve currency, if it went back to the world that it had pre, the 1920s, when the dollar was not the world's reserve currency, the 20s and 30s, it might actually, in theory, work better for the US, but you'd have to do major changes within the US to make industrialization in the United States work. You'd have to return to the kind of Hamiltonian policies that were followed by the United States up to the period of the Cold War and a little beyond. At the moment, there's no sign of that. And if the US loses the reserve currency position of the dollar, then obviously investing in the US without those changes becomes very unattractive.
Sparky says, I hope Lula uses Brazil's geopolitical position as leverage to help Brazil, like Erdogan does to help Turkey.
I endorse that completely.
And from Jamila Asfu says, thank you, gentlemen. Brings RIA news.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Those are all the questions from our Q&A with Garland Nixon. Thank you very much.